data visualization on the web is really useful. You can show users patterns and trends and lots of data in a relatively succinct form, as opposed to expecting them to kind of dig into a big table or a spreadsheet or something and pick these patterns out for themselves. The challenge we have is that a lot of data visualization techniques and tools out of the box don't really work for people who are using some types of assistive technology. And I wanted to spend a little while going through how the accessibility guidelines, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines at WCAG, can be applied to simple data visualizations built with the D3 JavaScript library. So I guess I should start by introducing D3. D3 stands for Data-Driven Documents, and it's a JavaScript library designed for data visualization. Now, it includes the features that you need to take data in, for example, from an API, from a CSV file, from a JSON file, from basically wherever you like, and to turn it into some visualizations that use some really powerful tools. So it's got tools for animation, it's got tools for interactive elements, but I should say that today, in this video, I'm going to focus on really simple graphics, things like bar charts that you can imagine putting inside a news article or a blog post. But what is nice is if you go to their website, and if you're not familiar with it, you should definitely do this first. Go to the website, you can find a lot of these examples that have the code available. So I think quite a lot of these have got the original code. And there we go. So you can see the visualization, and underneath it you've got all the original code, which you can use as a starting point to get really started with D3. So for most of the rest of the video, I'm going to be using this example to demonstrate the improvements we can make. And basically this is a simple bar chart which is being created from a CSV file. The HTML is simply just an empty div with an ID, and inside the code, the JavaScript, we create an SVG element, give it a width and a height, and we append it to this div. And then once we've got our CSV file open, we create the axes and we add the bars, which are just rectangles. Now, as I say, I'm not going to go through all of this now. This is the topic for something different. So I'm going to assume you're okay with what's going on here. But you can find lots of examples like this online. Now, at this point, I'm actually going to switch very quickly into Safari because it has slightly better voiceover support, and I can use it to quickly demonstrate something. So this is still the same pen, but let's see what happens when we try and move our screen reader into this visualization.
Voiceover on Safari. Roland Descript Roland in CodePen preview. USA. CHA. Rock. Voiceover off. Okay, so it's a little weird. It didn't. You might think, looking at this, that this is an image, but VoiceOver clearly doesn't think so, and it went inside the container and started going from bit of text to bit of text. This isn't behaving like an image, even though to people who are not using any assistive technology, this looks like it's probably an image. So what can we do? Well, if you are familiar with what's going on here, you can see on lines 8 and 9, we're setting the attributes, the width and the height attributes for this SVG tag. And actually, if you want to see, let's do this actually in here. So what you can see is that inside the page we have our div with the ID chart container, and inside that we have the SVG, and we've just set these two, width and height, in the JavaScript using D3 on lines 8 and 9. So what we could actually do here is using some
more attributes, we can actually set this to behave like an image. So that is by setting the role attribute to image. So let's see if we save this now. Saved, good. And jump back into Safari and refresh. Has this improved?
Image.
Image.
Voiceover off.
So we now know that that is an image. The problem is that we now don't give our assistive technology users any information on what that image is of, or what information we're conveying to users who are not using assistive technology. So if you've done any web accessibility stuff ever at all, you will know the alt attribute. Now, that would be great here, except there isn't an alt attribute for the SVG element. So we have to use an ARIA attribute here instead. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, but again, let's not go too far into that here. What you do need to know is that in this case, we can use ARIA label, and we can give basically the same text we would if this were an alt attribute. So for this purpose, I think the best thing to do, because alt attributes, you generally want to keep text below about 150 characters. So I think the best thing to do here would be to give a really clear description of what we've got. And I'll put some links to some stuff I found useful for describing data visualizations using alt attributes in the description. But basically, we want to say what the type of chart is. So let's say this is a bar chart showing and what the data are. So that's the medal Olympic medal tallies for several countries. USA, and finally you want to say what the overall trend is. So here I'm going to put USA lead with over 90 medals. Now, that's not all the information this conveys, but in terms of having a clear, succinct alt attribute, I think this is a really good start. So let's just quickly double check that that has worked. All right, let's get VoiceOver on.
VoiceOver on Safari. Role and description example line. In Roland in CodePen preview frame heading level 1. Bar chart showing Olympic medal tallies for several countries. USA led with over 90 medals. Image.
All right, so that tells us everything that the key headline of that image we've now correctly described, and it behaves like an image even though it's SVG embedded within the HTML. Okay, so now we've made the overall trend, the big headline of this visualization available to people who are using assistive technology, but we haven't made all the same information available as text. And what we probably need for this is an HTML table, so that each pair, each combination of team code and number of medals can be shown as plain text and navigated more easily. So HTML table is definitely the way to go. Now, if this is a one-off visualization and the data are hard-coded or whatever, it's quite okay to just stick a table inside your HTML and leave it at that. But if your data are coming in from outside, let's say this was getting its data from somewhere else and it's updating all the time, you don't want to have to update the table as well. So we can actually use more D3 code to generate the table, because D3 is just working on any elements it likes. And here we create an SVG. We can also create a table. Now let's see how we do that. So I didn't want to sit here typing away with you watching, so I just paused it and let's continue. So we have a table visible now, and all we're doing here underneath where we create the axes and the bars, we basically do the same with a table. So we select the chart container div, we add a table to it, we add a head and a body to the table. And then we create the header row using this columns array. And then using the columns original, which contains the name from the CSV, names from the CSV file for the columns, we take the we loop through and create cells for each value. So now we do have equivalent information in the graphic and in something text-based. So we've got a good text alternative to the graphic. Now it's up to you. Do you want this to be always visible? I've seen quite a lot of people seem to go with tabs. So you'd have the chart in a tab and you can switch to the tab that's got the table in. Sometimes there's sort of a accordion style fold out panel that appears with the table in. This is a design decision. It depends on how you feel, what else you use in other places, and if you can test it with real users, that's probably best. Now, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines put a big focus on color contrast as well. And we can test that really easily. If we just grab our, at the moment we're on a white background here, but if we grab our fill color, and if we go to contrastratio.com, we can say white background, that's the default, and let's try this one. Okay, so this tells us that the contrast ratio is 1.52, and if you don't know what that means, that's fine, because it tells you here that it fails WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. So you can see how terrible it looks when the color is when this is the text color. So let's try a darker color. Let's see what we can come up with. Let's see if we can come up with a darker blue. So 000070. All right, that's dark. Okay, let's give this one a try then. So this says that it passes AAA for all size text and AA for user interface components and graphical objects. That's what we need. You can tweak this a little bit. You can probably get quite high on this, but let's go for something that really works rather than trying to squeeze the lightest color we can out of this. Okay, so that goes in there, and let's see how it looks now. All right, really clear, almost black. We can actually go a tiny bit lighter, I think. Just check. Does 90 work there? Okay, that's maybe a bit brighter. Okay, great. So we've got quite a nice bright, well, okay, so we've got a dark blue bar there now. Now let's confuse this even more, and let's see what happens if we take this now let's see what happens if a user who prefers, let's say, high contrast in their browser has been here. So let's head to browser settings. I'm doing this in Firefox. Most browsers have very similar settings. So in colors, we can pick a background, and it's currently white. Let's try the background in black. And then let's try the text in white. All right. And now we head here. Now, we didn't specify a color for the axes, but they followed the text color, which is quite nice. But we did specify a color for these bars, and they now have very poor contrast. We can actually see what if this was black instead of white. There, back to the 1.4. Wonderful. So this is a bit of a problem. Now, there are different ways we might approach this. One option would be to actually, up here, where we are creating the SVG, giving it its width and its height and its description, would be to actually add a rectangle already that goes behind the whole canvas we have here for the SVG and forces it to have a certain background color. This isn't respecting the user's preference, but this is maybe the quickest and easiest way to guarantee that the user changing the background color of the page doesn't break your SVG. So let's see how that would look. Okay, so I paused that again while I was writing the code, but let's have a look at what we've got now. We've got these lines here from 15 to 20. So the first element we add to our SVG now is a rectangle, and we give it a width and a height and a white fill color. And the other difference there is now is I've explicitly given the color black that was, it was using the default text color before. But if we're going to force the background to be white, we should probably force the foreground text to be black. So we've got that in on both axes. So let's head over here and see how it looks with our change. So now, with our changed browser settings, we can see that this all appears as if it's got this background color. So if the user just changes their background color in their browser, they can now see it without any risk from that. Now, this isn't respecting the user's preferences. I would suggest the better way would be to actually switch all of these attributes, so color and fill and that, to use CSS. And because this is inside our HTML, we can absolutely do that. So let's take a moment and let's see how that would look. Okay, and after another quick pause, we are now getting all the colors from CSS, which is definitely my favorite way to do this, because you can really carefully match the styles of the page it's embedded in them. So we've removed all of the colors as I could find from here, and we've added now classes. So a class for each axis, or the same class for each axis, a class for the bar, and a class for the background. So you can make sure the background matches the page, and that way if the user overrides the page background, the chart still looks okay. But it means that you could use, for example, I won't write it out now, but you could use a media query, for example, prefers color scheme. So if the user has got their device set to dark mode, which is really easy for people using iPhones and Macs at least, and on Windows, I think, then we can just obey that, and we can control the colors, we can control how it appears, but we can respect the user's preferences for light or dark. And the other one to remember if you're testing this is Windows High Contrast Mode, which does have some particular CSS selectors, but we won't go through those here. So in this final topic, I wanted to touch on understandability, because that's a big part of the WCAG guidelines. And it's a bit difficult because it really involves having a good idea yourself of who your audience are and what is likely to make sense to them. So in this example, I've used the 3-letter codes of the Olympic teams. So most of these match the country codes, but not exactly. Now, in general, WCAG does require that abbreviations be explained when they're used. But here, at the moment, no explanation is given. Now, the easiest thing might be to just swap the codes to the actual name of the National Olympic Committee. And I've actually got a CSV file ready where I do that. So let's see how that looks. Okay, so the table actually looks pretty good. We've got the names of them here. But actually the labels on the chart are actually quite broken now. We're just getting bits of them. And some of the country names are short enough to fit there, but not all of them. Now, the first thing we can try is, what if we get rid of the rotation? So let's see what happens if we remove rotate from each of the country names. Okay, now we're getting this horrible overlapping. Now, this is the reason that my personal preference is, when you're including charts in articles and blog posts and things, you probably want to prefer a horizontal bar chart over a vertical one when you can. So I'm going to take a moment now to swap this from vertical to horizontal, and then we'll take a look at how that looks. Okay, so that one was actually a bit tedious to write, but basically I have gone through and I've swapped what was the X into a Y. So it's now the vertical axis is the grouped one, and horizontal axis, our x-axis here, is the linear scale. And at the end here we have the new definition of the rectangles, which has been tweaked very slightly. But in general, you'll still recognize how this code works. Now, let's have a look. You see that we still are missing some of the text around here. But actually, we've been using this margin object here to define these. So let's jump to, let's try 160. Okay, that looks nice. So now we can see the full names, and we can still see the bars quite nicely. Again, you can make these responsive if you want to. You can do whatever you like basically with these. And there we have eliminated the abbreviations, which is something to watch out for when you're trying to be as inclusive and accessible as possible. And in doing so, we've also got rid of the rotated text, which some people might not find very nice to read, even though it's not explicitly forbidden anywhere. And there we are. So I think we've picked all the low-hanging fruit that there are with regards to making simple data visualizations with D3 accessible on the web. We started with something like this, and we've taken care of the screen reader stuff, so the description and the role. We've taken care of adding a table. We have checked the colors. We've removed any sort of dependence on color, and we've checked the contrast of them. And we've also taken care of the abbreviations to help with any understandability type issues. So hopefully this is a little bit better than it was before. It's, as I say, not perfect, and we haven't talked about anything like animation or interactivity, which can be really big parts of data visualization as well. I might have a look at those in the not too distant future. But thank you for listening, and I will put links to basically everything I referred to in the description, along with a checklist of the things that we looked at today, and links to these CodePen examples as well. Thank you. See you soon.